Hey folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things, and I've been watching The Last of Us recently, and in a surprising change of pace for a video game adaptation, it doesn't suck. So in honor of this minor miracle, I thought I'd make a mushroom man of my own. Now, before I get this video started, I just want to apologize if my voice sounds weird. It's not like I'm sick or anything, this is just what my voice sounds like, but if it sounds weird to you, then I'm sorry, I guess. Anyways, much like me and I assume you, our mushroom man has a skeleton hiding underneath all those layers of both natural and synthetic layering we like to call clothing and skin. Of course, the big difference here is that his skeleton is made of mostly aluminium, whereas ours are made of an equal mix of collagen, calcium, and microplastics. Also, our bones are mostly held together with muscle and undigested dog hair, while his bones are kept in place with copious amounts of super glue. And while we have things like tendons to keep our various bits and bobs from sliding off our bones, this particular mushroom man needs to make use of finer armature wire wound around his aluminium bones to keep it all in place. Otherwise, with that entirely accurate anatomical lesson finished, I'll mark out where my mushroom man's joints go so I can find an appropriately spooky pose to position him in before mounting him on a block of wood. Then it's just a case of building up the basic body shape of the mushroom man by sticking lumps of clay onto the armature until I've got a relatively accurate body shape. More specifically, I want to try and keep the muscle mass to a minimum and focus on a lankier body type. That being said, it wouldn't be a north of the border video if I didn't give him some full fat ham chops on the back end. Otherwise, once I've got the majority of the armature covered in a layer of somewhat anatomically accurate clay skin, I can start to refine the shape. Now, this is of course a zombified mushroom man who has almost entirely succumbed to the horrors of his cordyceps nightmare, so it's safe to say that I've got more than a little wiggle room when it comes to the surface details. Now, speaking of said surface details, once I've smoothed the surface into a nice smooth surface, I'll use my silicone shapers to add some initial lumps and bumps as sort of a base layer of gnarliness that I can build on later. Now, before I move on to the gnarlification of said surface, I want to get my clicker's feet in place. A lot of my design decisions are based on answering one simple question: how can I make this model with the least amount of effort possible? With that in mind, I was a bit torn between making a newly turned clicker with a mouthful of creepy, feely fingers protruding from his mouth, and a much more aged version that's almost entirely converted the horror version of Super Mario's Toad. Now, the trade-off was that with a newly turned clicker, I could get around having to make the detailed feet since he'd be wearing shoes and I could hide a lot of the surface goop under some well-worn but still functional clothing. On the other hand, a nearly completely converted Man-shroom would provide me with the opportunity to cut out some of my least favorite parts of the process, which I'll get to later. Obviously, I went with the mostly entirely mushroomed Man-shroom version, which means I need to start adding copious amounts of fungi and lichen and other gnarly growths along the body. This actually turned out to be a blessing in disguise though, since it meant that I could get away with an awful lot of ugly surface details. After all, it's not that I'm just lacking in the patience or skill necessary to get this texture looking smooth and natural, it's that I want it to look lumpy and bumpy and gross. Now, with any zombie-related creation, it's easy to get caught up in the blood and gore, but I really wanted the mushrooms to be the main course on display. That being said, given the way these fun guys flop around all willy-nilly, it seems unlikely that they wouldn't have a bump or two scattered around their bodies from my life of aggressively floppy parkour. Otherwise, once I've got the lower limbs looking like a pair of fleshy tree trunks you might find in a forest painted by Hieronymus Bosch, I can start to work on doing the same thing to the upper body. It's essentially the same process of slapping little lumps of clay haphazardly onto the torso and upper limbs, kinda wherever I feel like it, before blending them into the body, then applying whatever surface texture over top. The cling film will help me apply the texture to the clay without leaving sharp cuts or indents, and it helps to blend the textures into the rest of the model. Otherwise, that's the majority of the body done, and I can get to work on the hands. Usually I like to do the lion's share of hand sculpting separately, then stick them in place, but that often leads to comically oversized fingers, which, given the usual design of my models, it kinda works. This time though, I'm gonna sculpt directly onto the model, attaching and shaping the fingers as I go. One thing I found really helps with getting my finicky fingers to hook and curl naturally is to apply gentle pressure with a pair of flat tweezers. Fingers are actually a lot more square than I think most people realize, and the flat tweezers help to give them a bit more shape while also aiding in the positioning. Otherwise, with my fingers in place, I can add some more lumps and mushroomy bits to the forearms to help blend them into the rest of the body. Now, before I get to making the head though, I want to give the whole thing a bake to save my progress, and before I do that, I'm gonna add some teeny tiny mushroom feely dealies around the shoulders. I've made these with some bent and warped armature wire, which I'll bulk the tips up by applying a thick glob of bacon bond. Otherwise, it's into the oven to bake, so I can get to work on the head. Now cast your mind back about 1 minute and 50 seconds ago and you'll remember that I mentioned the trade-off of making a well-worn man-shroom. Sure, I had to make some detailed feet, but when it comes to making his face, well, I get to basically cut the whole thing off. In fact, the only real detail that I'll keep will be his teeth, and I really like making teeth. Is that weird? To make the mushroom portion of his head, I'll take a flat worm of clay and loop it back on itself at somewhat random angles until I'm left with a nice loopy ribbon that I can then jam into his head. Then it's just a case of blending a couple more pieces in until my man-shroom looks like he'd fit in at a royal wedding. And once I've got my fancy frilly hairpiece in place, I'll get a better angle for the head, then start adding various lumps and growths around the neck to blend it all together. Then it's just a case of adding an ear onto the side, realizing I don't feel like doing the other ear, so instead I'm going to cover that side in more lumps and bumps, then I'll do some final cling film skin texture, and it's into the oven for a final bake so as I can get to the painting. No, I want to start with a nice white base because my plan for coloring this man-shroom is to start with a very sloppy pale pink base coat and then work my way into darker shades of still pretty pale pinks until I've got a motley assortment of kinda gross looking pink skin tones. I'm mixing my paints with lots of water and flow improver so that I can keep the entire model moist. This way when I'm adding the darker colors I can wet blend as I go. I don't want any harsh transitions between the colors, so by doing all the blending while it's wet, my hope is that all the colors should kinda wash together. I don't really know what I'm doing, but it ends up looking pretty okay, which is really high praise for a lot of my work. I'm also barely mixing the paint in the pots when I add a darker color so that as I put it on the model I get different shades within shades. Again, I'm sure there are professional painters out there that are cringing right now, but this is technically my job, which kinda means I'm a professional, which should shed some light on just how competent your average professional is. All this to say, if it's a stupid idea but it works, then maybe it's not such a stupid idea after all.
I have no idea what I'm doing, but I know I'm doing it really, really well.
Otherwise, once I've got my bruised pink and purple but oddly slimy mushroom man mostly figured out, I'll start to add the highlights and details to really bring out the gnarly, starting with the red for the various bloody scrape scratches and overly excitable drooly bits, followed by some strategically placed earwax yellow highlights on the tips of the feely dealies and anywhere else I think might contrast nicely. And with the skin tones finished, I can get to clothing our man-shroom in a nice pair of blue jean shorts. And to texturize said blue jean shorts, I'll use this leftover fabric from my backdrop. By rolling the blue clay into an extra thin sheet, I compress it onto the fabric, which will then transfer the texture neatly onto the clay. Then it's just a case of cutting it into strips and sticking it onto the man-shroom to cover his mushroomy shame. These pants are a bit too pristine though, so to give them the appearance of having been through the ringer, I'll rip and tear and pull and shear with my tweezers until every edge is a ragged, edge. For his shirt, I'd originally planned on giving him a white shirt since I thought that the white would contrast really nicely with the pinks, purples, and reds of his skin tone. However, I also realized that it probably wouldn't stay white for very long, so instead I decided to go with the dirty, beigey color that it would just end up looking like. Unfortunately though, that color didn't contrast at all and his shirt kinda gets lost in the rest of the mess. Next time I'm just gonna go with a black and call it a day. Once I'd baked the freshly added outfits to cure the clay, I can start to grunge them up so they don't look quite so new. The blue jeans will get a series of lighter and lighter blue top coats before I give them a final dirty bluish greenish sponge bath followed by a white dry brush to bring out the threads. Then the shirt will get a series of slightly lighter beige and white top coats to try and bring it back to the original white I was going for. Finally, I'll give both pieces a once-over with strategically placed brown stains to make them look real dirty, followed by some even more strategically placed blood splotches and stains. Last but not least, I'll tickle the man-shroom with a touch of tacky glue so that I can stick on a couple fingerfuls of light brown paintbrush bristles. Once the glue's had a chance to dry, I can come back with some teeny tiny scissors and cut it back, leaving me with some unsettling mushroom fibers. And with that, our man-shroom is finished, so all we need to do is make a base. Broken cityscapes and copious creeping mushrooms is a recurring theme in The Last of Us, so I'm going to start by making a big round clay disc that will fit on top of the MDF disc that I want to use as my base. To make this look like it's a proper chunk of concrete, I'll bake it in the oven so it's nice and hard, and snap it into smaller puzzle pieces. Then using my knife in a way that makes my balls itch watching back while editing, I'll chop up the edges and make them look all smashed and broken before doing the same to the rest of the surface until it looks like a very well used hunk of concrete. This then gets a quick sanding, which will mar the surface and make it look a little less smooth. Now my MDF base I want to change from beige to black, and I can start to reassemble my flooring. To make my cordyceps carpet, I'll take some chunky wormy dealies of Christmas carrot orange clay, and using a variety of ball styluses, I can make a set of oddly shaped floor lungs and then connect them with a series of extra long wormy dealies. Then it's just a case of filling in the rest of the space with as little or as much orange floor fungi as needed. I'll then use some of the leftover chunks of clay to add a bit of rubble to the base before giving everything a black watery wash, the excess of which gets wicked away before doing the same with a brown wash. I'll use an objectively disgusting shade of watery yellow to color the inner parts of the mushroom lungs, then tickle the tips with a darker brown wash. Finally, while everything was drying, I made a handful of pre-baked feely dealies which I can then glue into place to give the base a bit more depth. All that's left to do then is drill a couple of mounting holes so that I can slide my Man-shroom into place. Otherwise, that's us finished here and onto the Glamour Shots. As always, a huge thank you to the absolute smoke shows over on Patreon, and a special shout out to my newest patrons, Emma Jones, Ogden Devitt, Skylaria, Sean Carlson, Sai Husiga, Nicole Giordano, Monkey5541, Shameful878, Judith, Brian Lasabia, Desiree Kuhn, Cynical Gamers, Exy, Kabuki Bukaki, Filbert, Wamaru, Dr. Minion Caffeine, JT Bird, Amy Fry, and Madison Thoraldson. You are the parasitic mushrooms growing inside my brain that keep me churning out content despite having died more than a year ago. As always, if you subscribe to this video, then consider liking that smash button. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Cheers.